The fluorescent lights above. Gate 22C hummed with that particular frequency that seemed designed to strip away human dignity, casting everything in the sickly pallor of institutional indifference. Sophia Anderson sat in the far corner of the waiting area, her weathered hands folded over a small leather satchel that had seen better decades. The airport's evening rush swirled around her like a river of pressed suits and rolling luggage, but she remained an island of stillness in the chaos. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Her gray hair, pulled back in a simple bun, caught the harsh light as she lifted her head to check the departure board for the 100th time. Flight 447 to Washington, D.C., still delayed. The red letters seemed to mock her, and she could feel the familiar weight of disappointment settling in her chest like an old friend she'd rather not see. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice belonged to Bradley Chen, a gate agent whose name tag gleamed with the false brightness of customer service training. He approached with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to weaponize politeness. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Sophia looked up, noting the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers, the slight tightness around his mouth that suggested this wasn't a routine request. She reached into her satchel, fingers brushing against a photograph she always kept there, a young man in military dress blues, his smile captured forever in silver and shadow. "Of course," she said quietly, producing the crumpled boarding pass. Her voice carried the soft cadence of someone who had learned that speaking too loudly often meant not being heard at all. Bradley examined the pass with theatrical precision, turning it over as if searching for hidden messages. Behind him, his supervisor, Janet Morrison, watched with the keen interest of someone who had found entertainment in the evening's mundane routine. Janet's perfectly coiffed hair and razor-sharp blazer spoke of someone who had clawed her way up from the bottom and intended to remind everyone of the journey. "Ma'am, I'm showing here that you're in seat 22A, that's first class." Bradley's tone carried a note of skepticism that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Sophia felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times over the years when people looked at her worn coat, her sensible shoes, her lack of designer accessories, and made their calculations about what she was worth. "Yes," she said simply. "That's my seat." Janet stepped forward now, her heels clicking against the terminal floor like a countdown timer. "Bradley, what seems to be the issue?" "This passenger," Bradley gestured toward Sophia as if she were evidence in a trial, "claims to have a first-class ticket, but ... He let the sentence hang, allowing Janet to fill in the blanks with her own assumptions. Around them, other passengers began to take notice. A businessman in expensive suit lowered his newspaper, his eyes moving between Sophia and the gate agents with the interest of someone watching the street performance. A young mother pulled her children closer, as if poverty might be contagious. An elderly couple whispered to each other behind their hands, their voices carrying just far enough for Sophia to catch fragments. Probably confused. Sub you, then they check these things. Holding up the line. Double quotes. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a neurosurgeon returning from a medical conference in Chicago, sat 3 seats away from Sophia. He had been watching the interaction unfold with growing discomfort, recognizing in Sophia's quiet dignity something that reminded him of his own grandmother, a woman who had cleaned offices at night to put him through medical school. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup as he fought the urge to intervene. Across the waiting area, Elena Vasquez, a social worker who had spent the day in court advocating for foster children, looked up from her case files. She had developed a sixth sense for injustice over the years, and something about the scene at the gate counter made her stomach clench with familiar anger. She watched as Sophia's shoulders seemed to shrink inward. A defensive posture Elena had seen too many times in the vulnerable populations she served. "Ma'am," Janet said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm going to need to ask you to step aside while we sort this out. There seems to be some confusion about your ticket." Sophia stood slowly, her movements careful and measured. The satchel remained clutched in her hands, and Dr. Thompson noticed how her knuckles had gone white with the pressure of holding on. She moved to the side as requested, but her eyes never left Janet's face. "There's no confusion," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the tremor Dr. Thompson could detect at its edges. "I have a confirmed reservation in seat 22A. I've had it for 3 weeks." Bradley pulled up something on his computer screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone who had performed this dance many times before. "I'm showing that seat was upgraded just this morning. Are you sure you didn't receive any notification about a seating change?" The lie was smooth, practiced, delivered with the kind of confidence that made questioning it seem unreasonable. Sophia knew it was a lie. She had checked her reservation that very morning, had printed her boarding pass at home to avoid exactly this kind of confusion. But she also knew that arguing would only make things worse. "I didn't receive any notification," she said quietly. Janet sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "Well, these systems can be glitchy. Tell you what, we can get you rebooked in coach. There are still a few middle seats available." The businessman with the newspaper snorted softly, a sound that might have been amusement or disgust. The young mother shook her head and turned away, suddenly very interested in her phone. The elderly couple's whispers grew more audible. Should have known ... Trying to scam her way into first class ... Should have known ... Trying to scam her way into first class ... Should have known ... These days ... double quotes. Dr. Thompson felt his jaw clench. He had seen this before, the systematic erosion of dignity that happened when people decided someone didn't belong. It was the same mechanism that had tried to convince him he didn't belong in medical school, that had made professors question whether he was truly qualified for the prestigious residency programs he'd applied to. The difference was that he'd had advocates, mentors who had believed in him. Sophia seemed to be facing this alone. Elena Vasquez closed her case files and stood up. She had seen enough children destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them to recognize the signs of institutional bullying when she saw it. There was something about Sophia's quiet strength that reminded her of the foster mothers who had saved her own life years ago, women who had been overlooked and underestimated, but who possessed a kind of resilience that could move mountains. "Excuse me," Elena said, approaching the counter. "I couldn't help but notice that you're having some kind of issue with this passenger's ticket. As someone who travels frequently for work, I'm curious, what exactly is the problem?" Janet's smile became even more brittle. "This is really a matter between the airline and our passenger, ma'am. But thank you for your concern. I'm just wondering," Elena continued, her voice carrying the calm persistence of someone who had questioned hostile bureaucrats before, "because I heard you mention that the seat was upgraded this morning. That's interesting, because first-class seats are usually the last to be reassigned. It would be quite unusual for the system to randomly upgrade someone out of their confirmed reservation." Bradley's fingers paused over his keyboard. Dr. Thompson leaned forward in his chair, suddenly very interested in the conversation. Other passengers began to pay closer attention, sensing that the evening's entertainment had taken an unexpected turn. "Ma'am," Janet said, her tone sharpening, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. This really doesn't concern you." "Actually," Dr. Thompson said, standing up and joining Elena at the counter, "I think it does concern all of us. We're all passengers on this flight, and we all have an interest in fair treatment. Sophia looked between Elena and Dr. Thompson with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. It had been so long since anyone had stepped up to defend her that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have allies. Her grip on the leather satchel relaxed slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to hope that maybe things would turn out differently than they usually did. The leather satchel itself was more than it appeared, worn brown, leather that had been soft and supple once, now bearing the scars of decades of careful use. Inside, along with the photograph of the young soldier, were documents that most people would never need to carry, clearances and authorizations that spoke to a life lived in service to things larger than oneself. But Sophia had learned long ago that showing people her credentials too early often made them feel threatened, defensive. It was better to let them reveal their own character first. Janet looked around the waiting area, suddenly aware that they had attracted an audience. Several passengers were openly watching now, and she could see phones being discreetly positioned to record. The last thing she needed was a viral video of airline staff mistreating an elderly passenger. "Look," she said, forcing her voice into a more conciliatory tone. "Maybe we can work something out, Mrs. ... She glanced at the boarding pass still clutched in Bradley's hand. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm sure this is just a computer error. We can get you onto the flight, and once we're in the air, we'll see if there are any first-class seats available." It was a non-solution disguised as generosity, and everyone present knew it. Dr. Thompson shook his head. "That's not really addressing the issue, is it? Mrs. Anderson has a confirmed first-class reservation. She shouldn't have to hope for an available seat. She already has one." "The system shows," Bradley began, but Elena cut him off. "What does the original reservation show?" "Not whatever was changed this morning, but the original booking from 3 weeks ago?" Bradley's eyes darted to Janet, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The silence stretched for several seconds, filled only by the ambient noise of the busy terminal, announcements echoing from distant gates, the rumble of luggage wheels, the electronic beeps of boarding pass scanners. "I think," Sophia said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a gentle blade, "that we should probably just get everyone boarded. I don't want to delay the flight any longer." It was a graceful retreat, an offer to let everyone save face. But Dr. Thompson recognized it for what it was, the same kind of tired surrender he had seen in his grandmother, when she was too exhausted to fight another battle against people who had already decided she didn't matter. "Mrs. Anderson," he said gently, "what seat number is on your boarding pass?" She held up the pass, and he could see it clearly. 22A, first class. The date showed she had checked in 24 hours earlier, well within the normal time frame. Everything about her reservation appeared legitimate. Elena pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm just documenting this for my own records," she said, her voice carrying the professional tone of someone who had learned to create paper trails. "Mrs. Anderson, can you tell me when you first booked this reservation?" 3 weeks ago, Sophia replied. My son arranged it. He wanted to make sure I was comfortable for the flight." There was something in the way she said, some that made Dr. Thompson look more closely at her face. He saw grief there, old and deep, the kind that never really healed, but learned to live quietly in the shadows of a person's eyes. The photograph in her satchel suddenly made more sense, not a memento of the living, but a treasured reminder of someone lost. The boarding announcement crackled over the gate speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding. Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. We'll start with our first-class passengers and those requiring special assistance." Janet straightened her blazer and put on her professional smile. "Well, Mrs. Anderson, it looks like we need to get boarding started. If you'd like to join the general boarding group, we can see about getting you settled." It was the final insult wrapped in courtesy, the suggestion that Sophia joined the back of the line like everyone else, despite having a first-class ticket, despite having been publicly humiliated. Despite having done nothing wrong, except not look the part that Janet and Bradley expected first-class passengers to play. But before Sophia could respond, before she could accept this latest indignity with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the ordeal, Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen, and her expression changed from concern to something approaching shock. "Mrs. Anderson," she said slowly, "I just received a very interesting message. It seems there's been some kind of ... situation with air traffic control." Dr. Thompson frowned. "What kind of situation?" Elena looked around the waiting area, suddenly aware that whatever was happening was bigger than a simple seating dispute. "I'm not entirely sure, but it appears that there's been a priority override issued for this flight. Something about VIP protocol." Janet's confident expression faltered. "What are you talking about?" Before Elena could answer, Bradley's computer screen began flashing with urgent notifications. His face went pale as he read whatever was appearing on his monitor. "Janet," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." The evening rush continued around them, but something had changed in the air at Gate 22C. The ordinary rhythms of airport life, the boarding announcements, the roll of luggage wheels, the chatter of passengers seemed to recede into background noise as everyone present sensed that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Sophia remained standing to the side, her leather satchel held close, the photograph of the young soldier hidden safely inside. She had learned patience over the years, had developed the ability to wait and watch while others revealed their true nature. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the carefully constructed walls between her public life and her private history were beginning to crack, and somewhere in the distance, though no one at Gate 22C could hear it yet, the sound of jet engines was growing closer. Sophia Anderson had learned to carry silence like other people carried purses, close to her body, accessible when needed, protective of the contents within. As she stood beside Gate 22C, watching Bradley's face drain of color while he stared at his computer screen, she thought about the morning she had decided to take this trip. 3 days earlier, she had been in her small kitchen in Portland, Oregon, standing at the window that looked out over the garden Thomas had planted 15 years ago. The roses were blooming late this year, their red petals defiant against the October chill. She had been holding his letters, all 47 of them, sent from various bases across the Middle East over the course of his final deployment. She read them every few months, not because she had forgotten their contents, but because his handwriting was the closest she could come to touching his hand again. The morning routine had become sacred over the 3 years since the funeral. Coffee first, black, the way Thomas had taught her to drink it during his brief leaves home. "Sugar's a luxury in the field, Mom," he had said, grinning over his own cup during his last visit. "Better to learn to love the real thing." Then the letters read in chronological order, his voice so clear in her mind that she sometimes forgot he wasn't actually sitting across from her at the small wooden table. After the letters came the hardest part, deciding whether today would be a day she could manage to leave the house. The grocery store on Tuesdays, the library on Thursdays, church on Sundays, though she had stopped believing in most of what the pastor said about God's plan. What kind of plan included losing your only child to a roadside bomb in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map? But 3 days ago had been different. The phone had rung just as she was finishing Thomas's letter about the children in his unit's adopted village, how they had learned to say "thank you" in English and would chase the Humvees for candy. The voice on the other end had been crisp, professional, female. "Mrs. Anderson? This is Colonel Patricia Hayes with the Department of Defense. I'm calling about a ceremony we'd like you to attend." Sophia had been through enough military ceremonies to last several lifetimes. The funeral with its folded flag and hollow gratitude. The memorial service 6 months later where generals she'd never met spoke about Thomas's service to abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. The K Dedication of a small memorial garden at his old high school, where his former classmates had stood awkwardly in their civilian clothes, trying to reconcile the boy they remembered with the hero he had supposedly become. I appreciate the invitation, Colonel Hayes, but I think I've attended enough ceremonies. Ma'am, with all due respect, this one is different. We've been reviewing classified files from your son's final mission, and there are some things that have come to light. Things we think you should know. The silence that followed had been filled with 3 years' worth of unanswered questions. What exactly had happened on that road outside Kandahar? Why had the official reports been so vague, so sanitized? Why had the soldiers who served with Thomas looked away when she asked them to tell her about his last day? What kind of things? She had asked, "I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone, Mrs. Anderson, but I can tell you that your son's actions during his final mission may qualify him for a posthumous decoration. A significant one, and so she had agreed to come to Washington, had used the last of Thomas's life insurance money to buy a first-class ticket because he had always said that life was too short for middle seats and tiny bags of pretzels. It had been an extravagance that made her stomach clench with guilt, but also a small rebellion against the careful frugality that had defined her life since his death. Now, standing in the fluorescent nightmare of Gate 22C, she wondered if Thomas would have laughed at the cosmic joke of it all, his mother being denied the very luxury he had insisted she deserved, by people who couldn't see past the surface of things to the truth underneath. Dr. Marcus Thompson watched Sophia's face as she stared into the middle distance, and he recognized the expression. He had seen it in the families of his patients, that particular kind of stillness that came when someone was bracing for another disappointment, another casual cruelty from a world that had already taken too much. His own grandmother had worn that look during the worst of her battles with insurance companies and social workers who treated her like a burden instead of the woman who had raised 8 children on a housekeeper's salary. He thought about the conversation he'd had with his grandmother just before she died, when she had told him about all the times people had dismissed her, overlooked her, treated her as if she were invisible. "Marcus," she had said, her voice barely a whisper in the hospital bed, "promise me something. When you see someone being treated like they don't matter, you speak up. Because everybody matters to somebody." Elena Vasquez understood something different, but equally powerful as she watched Sophia. In her work with the foster care system, she had learned to read the signs of systemic abuse, the way institutions could grind people down through 1,000 small indignities, each one seemingly minor but collectively devastating. She had seen children give up hope not because of one traumatic event, but because of the accumulated weight of being told, day after day, that they weren't worth fighting for. There was something about Sophia that reminded Elena of Mrs. Rodriguez, the foster mother who had saved her life when she was 15. Mrs. Rodriguez had been a small woman with calloused hands and a face that showed every year of her 68. But she had possessed an inner strength that could have moved mountains. She had taken in Elena and 5 other kids, had loved them fiercely even when the system that was supposed to support her had failed at every turn. "You know what I learned from watching Mrs. Rodriguez?" Elena had told her supervisor just last month. "I learned that the people who look most fragile are often the strongest ones in the room. They just don't feel the need to prove it to anyone." The boarding announcement came again, more insistent this time. "Flight 447 passengers. We are ready to begin boarding. First-class passengers and those requiring special assistance may now approach the gate." Janet Morrison straightened her blazer and prepared to take control of the situation. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, entitled businessmen who threw tantrums about seat assignments, celebrities who expected special treatment, politicians who name-dropped their connections like currency. This elderly woman, however, presented a different kind of challenge. She wasn't screaming or demanding to speak to a manager. She wasn't threatening lawsuits or promising to never fly with the airline again. Her quiet dignity was somehow more unsettling than outright confrontation. Janet had worked her way up, from baggage claim to gate supervision over 15 years, and she had learned that projecting authority was everything in this business. Passengers respected strength, responded to confidence. Show weakness, show uncertainty, and you lost control of the situation. That was why she had developed her reputation for being tough but fair. Emphasis on tough. But something about the situation felt different. Bradley's computer screen was still flashing urgent notifications, and she could see his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process whatever information was cascading across his monitor. In her peripheral vision, she noticed that Dr. Thompson and Elena Vasquez had been joined by several other passengers, all of them watching the unfolding drama with increasing interest. "Mrs. Anderson," Janet said, forcing authority into her voice, "I really do need to ask you to step aside now so we can begin boarding the other first-class passengers." Sophia looked at her with those quiet eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "I am a first-class passenger. The system clearly shows. The system is wrong." The words were spoken softly, but they carried an absolute certainty that made Janet pause. There was something in Sophia's tone, a quality that Janet couldn't quite identify, but that made her feel suddenly off-balance. Dr. Thompson stepped closer to the counter. "Excuse me, but I'm curious. What exactly does your system show now? Because a few minutes ago, you said Mrs. Anderson's seat had been upgraded this morning. That suggested her original reservation was legitimate." Janet's jaw tightened. "Dr. Thompson, is it? I appreciate your concern, but this really is an airline matter." "Actually," Elena interjected, "I think Dr. Thompson raises a good point. If there was a system error that caused an upgrade this morning, then the original reservation should still be visible in your records. May I ask what the audit trail shows?" The question hit with the precision of someone who understood how institutional record-keeping worked. Elena had spent years fighting bureaucratic systems, tried to hide their mistakes behind technical jargon and procedural complexity. She knew that computer systems kept detailed logs of every transaction, every change, every modification to a record. Bradley looked up from his screen with panic in his eyes. "Janet, I think you need to see this. There's some kind of, I don't know how to describe it. Priority override? Security flag. I've never seen anything like this." Janet moved behind the counter to look at Bradley's screen, her confident expression faltering as she read whatever was displayed there. The color drained from her face, and she looked up at Sophia with something approaching alarm. "Ma'am," she said, her voice considerably less authoritative than it had been moments before. "I think there may have been some kind of misunderstanding." Sophia tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're listening to a sound they can't quite identify. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Before Janet could answer, a new voice cut through the gate area's ambient noise, crisp, professional, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" Everyone turned to see a woman in a dark suit approaching the gate counter. She was young, maybe 35, with short auburn hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her bearing suggested military training, and the small earpiece she wore indicated she was in communication with people who weren't present. "Agent Sarah Mitchell with the Department of Homeland Security," she said, showing her credentials to Janet and Bradley. "I need to speak with Mrs. Sophia Anderson immediately." The waiting area fell silent except for the distant sounds of the busy terminal. Dr. Thompson felt his heart rate accelerate. Elena's hand instinctively moved to her phone, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. The businessman with the newspaper openly stared, his financial reports completely forgotten. Sophia looked at Agent Mitchell with curiosity rather than alarm. "I'm Sophia Anderson." Agent Mitchell approached her with respectful but urgent purpose. "Mrs. Anderson, I apologize for the interruption, But we have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. I need to ask, are you currently scheduled to travel to Washington, D.C. for a meeting at the Pentagon? Yes, Sophia said simply. Tomorrow morning. Agent Mitchell nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected. Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a security development that changes the parameters of your visit. We're going to need to expedite your travel arrangements. Janet found her voice. Excuse me, Agent Mitchell, but we're trying to board a commercial flight here. This passenger has been... Agent Mitchell turned to Janet with a look that could have frozen water. Ma'am, with all due respect, Mrs. Anderson is no longer traveling on your commercial flight. We have alternate arrangements. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of tension that makes people hold their breath. Without realizing it, Dr. Thompson looked between Sophia and Agent Mitchell, trying to process what he was witnessing. Elena felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when she stumbled onto a story much bigger than it initially appeared. I don't understand, Sophia said quietly. What kind of security development? Agent Mitchell glanced around the waiting area, clearly calculating how much she could reveal in such a public setting. Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't discuss the details here, but I can tell you that your security clearance has been reactivated, and your presence is required in Washington tonight, not tomorrow morning. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Dr. Thompson felt the familiar sensation of being present for something historically significant, the way he had felt during his residency when he had been asked to assist with a surgery that would later be written about in medical journals. Elena's reporter instincts began firing on all cylinders as she realized she was witnessing the kind of moment that revealed hidden depths beneath ordinary surfaces. Sophia's grip on her leather satchel tightened slightly. My clearance was retired 3 years ago. Yes, ma'am, it was. But as of approximately 2 hours ago, it's been fully reinstated at your original level. Agent Mitchell's voice carried a gravity that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. Which means, Mrs. Anderson, that you currently hold the second highest security clearance in the United States government. The revelation hit the waiting area like a shockwave. Janet's mouth fell open. Bradley stared at his computer screen as if it might provide some explanation for what he was hearing. The businessman dropped his newspaper. The young mother with children looked around in confusion, trying to understand why everyone else had gone so quiet. Dr. Thompson felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The way Sophia carried herself, not broken by grief, but shaped by responsibility. The careful way she spoke, as if she were accustomed to being listened to by people who made important decisions. The leather satchel that she protected like it contained something precious and potentially dangerous. Elena's mind raced through possibilities. High-level security clearances weren't given to just anyone. They required extensive background checks, years of service in sensitive positions, demonstrated trustworthiness in matters of national importance. What had Sophia Anderson done in her life that qualified her for such access? And why had she been sitting in the airport, being treated like she was trying to scam her way into first class? Agent Mitchell, Sophia said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. Can you tell me if this has anything to do with my son's final mission? Agent Mitchell's expression softened slightly. Yes, ma'am. It has everything to do with your son's final mission. Outside the terminal's massive windows, the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, but it wasn't the familiar drone of commercial airliners. This sound was different, more purposeful, more urgent. Dr. Thompson recognized it from his years as a flight surgeon in the Air National Guard, military transport, flying information. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, something had changed. The tired, grieving mother who had been dismissed and humiliated at Gate 22C was still there, but now she was joined by someone else, someone who understood that duty came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who looked like they had no power at all. How long do I have to get ready? she asked. Agent Mitchell checked her watch. Your escort arrives in approximately 12 minutes. The 12 minutes stretched and compressed like time does in moments of crisis, each second both eternal and fleeting. Agent Mitchell had taken control of the gate area with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to manage situations that fell outside normal protocols. She spoke in low tones into her earpiece while keeping one eye on Sophia, who remained remarkably calm for someone whose life had just been turned upside down. Janet Morrison stood behind the check-in counter in a state of barely controlled panic. Her 15 years of airline experience had prepared her for many things: weather delays, mechanical failures, unruly passengers, even the occasional medical emergency. But nothing in her training had covered what to do when a passenger you'd been humiliating turned out to have a security clearance that apparently trumped everything else in the federal government. Bradley, she whispered urgently, what exactly is showing on your screen now? Bradley's hands shook as he navigated through screens he'd never seen before. There are so many flags and alerts that the system is barely responding. But Janet, look at this. He turned the monitor so she could see a series of codes and classifications that meant nothing to either of them. It says here that Mrs. Anderson's travel records are now classified under something called Blackstone Protocol. What the hell is Blackstone Protocol? I have no idea, but look at this part. It says any airline personnel who accessed her records in the past 24 hours will be contacted by federal investigators within 48 hours for routine security interviews. The blood drained from Janet's face. Security interviews. Federal investigators. Her mind raced through everything she had said and done in the past hour, every assumption she had made, every dismissive comment. She thought about her mortgage, her daughter's college tuition, the carefully constructed career that had taken her 15 years to build. Dr. Marcus Thompson watched this exchange from his seat, his medical training helping him recognize the physiological signs of acute stress in both gate agents. Janet's rapid breathing, the way Bradley kept running his hands through his hair, the sweat that was beginning to show on both their foreheads, despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. But more interesting to him was Sophia's reaction, or rather, her lack of reaction. She sat quietly in her corner, the leather satchel in her lap, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a regular commercial flight. There was no triumph in her posture, no sense of vindication now that the tables had turned. If anything, she looked sadder than before, as if being proven right was more burden than blessing. Elena Vasquez had positioned herself where she could observe both Sophia and Agent Mitchell while appearing to work on her phone. Her years in social work had taught her to read between the lines of official conversations, and she was beginning to piece together a story that was far more complex than anyone had initially realized. She watched as Agent Mitchell received some kind of update through her earpiece, saw the way the agent's expression grew more grave with whatever information she was receiving. Elena had worked with enough federal agencies to recognize the signs of a situation that was escalating beyond anyone's initial expectations. Mrs. Anderson, Agent Mitchell said, approaching Sophia with renewed urgency, I've just received an update from Washington. The situation we discussed has become more complicated. I need to ask you some questions that may seem strange, but I assure you they're necessary. Sophia looked up with the patient attention of someone who had learned to listen carefully to official briefings. Go ahead. 3 years ago, when your son's unit was deployed to Kandahar province, were you ever contacted by anyone from the intelligence community regarding his mission parameters? The question was specific enough to make everyone present understand that this conversation had moved far beyond anything they were qualified to overhear. Dr. Thompson found himself leaning forward, despite his better judgment. Elena's fingers hovered over her phone's recording app, though she suspected that documenting this conversation might not be in her best interest. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as if she were accessing memories she had carefully stored away. No, she said finally. But Thomas called me 2 days before his final patrol. He said some things. Things that didn't make sense at the time. What kind of things? He told me that if anything happened to him, I should remember that he had always been proud to serve, but that sometimes service meant doing things that looked wrong from the outside. He said that if anyone ever came to me with questions about his final mission, I should tell them to ask about the school. Agent Mitchell's expression sharpened. What school? He never said. But he made me promise to remember the word, school, and to mention it if anyone from the government ever came asking questions. Sophia's voice carried the weight of a promise kept through 3 years of grief and uncertainty. I thought it was just, I don't know, the stress of deployment making him paranoid. But I kept the promise anyway. The change in Agent Mitchell was immediate and dramatic. She stepped away from Sophia and spoke rapidly into her earpiece, her voice too low for others to hear, but her body language unmistakably urgent. When she returned, her entire demeanor had shifted. Mrs. Anderson, I need to inform you that your security escort has been upgraded. We're no longer talking about a routine military transport to Washington. What do we talk about then? Agent Mitchell glanced around the waiting area, clearly calculating how much she could reveal in such a public setting. Ma'am, in approximately 8 minutes, you're going to be met by a special aircraft that normally only transports heads of state and cabinet-level officials. Your son's final mission. It appears it may have prevented something catastrophic. Something that's still classified at the highest levels. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication through everyone present. Dr. Thompson felt his chest tighten as he began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she realized she was overhearing information that was probably classified beyond her security clearance to know. But it was Janet Morrison who broke first. The careful professional facade she had maintained for 15 years cracked like ice under pressure, and she found herself moving toward Sophia with something approaching desperation. Mrs. Anderson, she said, her voice high and tight with panic, I want you to know that there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The computer system. It must have been some kind of glitch. We never meant to suggest that your ticket wasn't legitimate. Sophia looked at her with the same quiet attention she had shown throughout the ordeal. But now there was something else in her expression, not anger, but a kind of weary recognition. She had seen this before, the way people scrambled to rewrite history when the balance of power shifted. I know, Sophia said simply. The 2 words carried more weight than any accusation or demand for apology. They acknowledged not just Janet's panic, but the entire systemic failure that had led to this moment, the assumptions, the prejudices, the casual cruelty that institutions visited on people who didn't fit there. Expectations. Elena Vasquez watched this exchange with the sharp attention of someone who had seen similar dynamics play out in courtrooms and government offices. She had witnessed the moment when bureaucrats realized they had mistreated someone who turned out to be more important than they appeared. The scrambling, the desperate attempts to reframe their actions, the transparent fear of consequences. But she had also seen something else in that moment, the grace of people who had been wronged, who chose not to weaponize their vindication. There was something profoundly powerful about Sophia's refusal to make Janet grovel, her quiet acceptance of an apology that hadn't actually been offered. The sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, and through the terminal's massive windows, they could see lights in the distance, not the orderly progression of commercial airliners, following standard approach patterns, but something else entirely. Something that moved with the purposeful urgency of an emergency response. Agent Mitchell received another update through her earpiece, and her expression grew even more grave. Mrs. Anderson, I need to prepare you for something. The aircraft that's coming for you, ... It's not just any government transport. It's Air Force too. The revelation hit the gate area like a physical force. Dr. Thompson's breath caught in his throat. Elena's phone nearly slipped from her hands. Even the other passengers who had been pretending not to listen openly stared now, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Air Force Two, the aircraft normally reserved for the Vice President of the United States, now being dispatched to collect an elderly woman who had been sitting quietly in a commercial airline gate, being treated like she was trying to scam her way into first class. "Agent Mitchell," Sophia said, her voice carrying a tremor for the first time since the confrontation began. "Why is the Vice President's plane coming for me?" "Because, ma'am, based on what you just told me about your son's final mission, we believe he may have uncovered intelligence that's crucial to an ongoing national security situation. Intelligence that died with him 3 years ago. But that may have been passed to you in ways we're only beginning to understand." The leather satchel in Sophia's lap suddenly felt heavier, its contents shifting from personal mementos to potential evidence in something much larger than her private grief. She thought about Thomas's letters, the careful way he had worded certain passages, the references to people and places that had seemed random at the time but might have been a code she was never meant to understand. Bradley. Chen stared at his computer screen in horror as new alerts continued to cascade across his monitor. Each notification seemed more ominous than the last, and he was beginning to understand that his casual participation in humiliating Sophia Anderson might have consequences that extended far beyond his job at the airline. "Janet," he whispered urgently, "there's something else. The system is showing that Mrs. Anderson's original ticket wasn't just first class. It was bought with some kind of government authorization code. We shouldn't have been able to change it at all." Janet felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. Government authorization codes were sacred in the airline industry. They indicated travel that was essential to national security, passengers who were not to be questioned or delayed under any circumstances. The fact that the system had allowed them to modify such a reservation suggested either a catastrophic computer failure or deliberate tampering. "How is that possible?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I think someone overrode the system manually. Earlier today, before Mrs. Anderson got to the airport." Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. "Janet, I think someone wanted her to miss this flight." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Elena Vasquez felt her investigative instincts fire as she realized she wasn't just witnessing bureaucratic incompetence, but something that might actually be sabotage. Someone had deliberately tried to prevent Sophia Anderson from reaching Washington, and they had used the airline's own prejudices as their weapon. Dr. Thompson stood up slowly, his medical training helping him recognize the signs of a situation that was spiraling into dangerous territory. The careful politeness that had characterized the earlier confrontation was evaporating, replaced by something much more urgent and potentially volatile. "Agent Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "I think you need to know that Mrs. Anderson's seating problems tonight weren't random. Someone deliberately sabotaged her reservation." Agent Mitchell turned to him with sharp attention. "Explain." Dr. Thompson gestured toward the gate counter where Bradley was frantically typing. "The gate agents just discovered that her ticket was purchased with a government authorization code, the kind that's supposed to be untouchable. But someone manually overrode the system to downgrade her seat. That's not a computer glitch. That's intentional interference." The revelation transformed Agent Mitchell's demeanor completely. She spoke rapidly into her earpiece, her voice urgent but controlled. When she finished, she turned back to Sophia with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal anger. "Mrs. Anderson, we now have reason to believe that someone has been actively trying to prevent you from reaching Washington. That changes everything about tonight's security protocols." Through the terminal windows, the approaching aircraft was now clearly visible, sleek, official, surrounded by escort fighters that maintained perfect formation against the darkening sky. Other passengers throughout the gate area had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly watching the unfolding drama. Sophia looked out at the approaching plane and thought about Thomas, about the phone call he had made 2 days before he died, about the careful way he had made her promise to remember a single word. She thought about the 3 years she had spent believing that his death had been a tragic but routine casualty of war, never knowing that his final mission might have been something far more significant. "Agent Mitchell," she said quietly, "if someone is trying to prevent me from reaching Washington, does that mean they know something about what Thomas discovered?" "Yes, ma'am. And it means that whatever your son found out there, it's still dangerous to someone. Dangerous enough that they're willing to risk exposing themselves to stop you from sharing it." Elena Vasquez felt her phone buzz with an incoming message and glanced at the screen. What she saw made her blood run cold. The message was from an unknown number, but its content was unmistakably threatening. "Stop documenting what you're seeing, or you'll join Mrs. Anderson's son." She looked up to find Agent Mitchell watching her with sharp attention. "Ms. Vasquez, did you just receive some kind of communication?" Elena nodded, her hands trembling as she showed Agent Mitchell the message. The federal agent's expression darkened as she read it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Mitchell announced to the gate area, her voice carrying absolute authority, "I need everyone to remain calm, but we now have reason to believe this situation involves active threats to national security. Airport security is being deployed to secure this area, and federal marshals are en route." The transformation was immediate. What had begun as a simple airline dispute had become something approaching a federal operation. Dr. Thompson found himself thinking about his grandmother's advice about speaking up for people who were being mistreated, and wondered if she had ever imagined it might lead to this. Janet Morrison stood behind the check-in counter, watching her carefully constructed career crumble in real time. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her casual cruelty toward Sophia Anderson hadn't just been morally wrong. It had made her an unwitting participant in something much darker. Outside, Air Force 2 was beginning its final approach, its escort fighters peeling off to establish a defensive perimeter around the airport. The sight was unprecedented, a plane normally reserved for the highest levels of government, dispatched to collect a woman who had been dismissed and humiliated because she didn't look important enough to matter. Sophia Anderson sat quietly in her corner, the leather satchel containing her son's letters held close to her chest. She thought about the boy who had grown up to be a soldier, who had called her 2 days before he died to give her a single word to remember. She thought about 3 years of grief and silence, and about the moment when silence would finally be broken. "Mrs. Anderson," Agent Mitchell said gently, "are you ready?" Sophia stood slowly, her movements careful and dignified. "I've been ready for 3 years. I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." As they prepared to leave Gate 22C, Elena Vasquez made a decision that would change her life. She approached Agent Mitchell with the careful courage of someone who had spent her career advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Agent Mitchell, I want to go on record as a witness to everything that happened here tonight. Mrs. Anderson was treated shamefully by people who should have known better. And I think that's part of this story too." Agent Mitchell nodded grimly. "Ma'am, I think you're absolutely right. And I think before this is over, we're going to need every witness we can get." The sound of Air Force 2 touching down on the runway echoed through the terminal like thunder, a reminder that some stories are too big to be contained by the small prejudices of ordinary people. As Sophia Anderson prepared to finally learn the truth about her son's last mission, everyone present understood that they had witnessed the moment when hidden history began to surface, when the powerless were revealed to hold the most important power of all. The truth. The secure corridor leading from Gate 22C to the private tarmac felt like a passage between worlds. Sophia Anderson walked beside Agent Mitchell, her leather satchel clutched tightly in her hands, while behind them a small procession of witnesses followed. Dr. Thompson, Elena Vasquez, and even Janet Morrison, who had been instructed by federal marshals that her presence was required for questioning. Creating detailed stories like this requires significant time and research. If you're finding value in this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our latest stories. Sophia Anderson walked beside Agent Mitchell, her leather satchel clutched tightly in her hands, while behind them a small procession of witnesses followed. Dr. Thompson, Elena Vasquez, and even Janet Morrison, who had been instructed by federal marshals that her presence was required for questioning. The fluorescent lighting gave way to the softer illumination of government vehicles that had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Men and women in dark suits with earpieces created a protective corridor, their professional vigilance a stark contrast to the casual dismissal Sophia had experienced just an hour earlier. Through the reinforced glass windows, Air Force Two dominated the tarmac like a sleeping giant. Its blue and white livery gleamed under the airport's floodlights, and the presidential seal on its fuselage served as a reminder that this aircraft normally carried people who shaped the destiny of nations. Tonight, it had come for a retired government analyst who had been dismissed as a confused elderly woman trying to scam her way into first class. Mrs. Anderson, Agent Mitchell said as they approached the final security checkpoint. Before we board, I need to prepare you for what you're about to learn. The briefing you'll receive on the aircraft will contain information that's been classified at the highest levels for 3 years. Information that died with your son, or so we thought. Sophia paused at the checkpoint, looking back at the small group that had followed them from the gate. Dr. Thompson caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. Elena Vasquez held up her phone, silently asking permission to continue documenting. Even Janet Morrison, pale and shaken, seemed to understand that she was witnessing something historically significant. Agent Mitchell, Sophia said quietly, these people stood up for me when they didn't have to. Whatever Thomas discovered, whatever he died protecting, they deserved to know the truth too. Agent Mitchell considered this for a moment, then spoke into her earpiece. After a brief conversation, she nodded. Ma'am, that's highly irregular, but given the circumstances, my superiors agree. They'll be debriefed separately, but they can accompany us to Washington. As they walked toward the aircraft, Sophia felt the weight of 3 years' worth of unanswered questions pressing against her chest. The official story had been simple. Sergeant Thomas Anderson had been killed by an improvised explosive device while on a routine patrol outside Kandahar. A tragic but common occurrence at a war zone. A brave soldier who had died serving his country. But Sophia had always known there was more to the story. The soldiers who had served with Thomas had been evasive when she asked about his final day. The military investigators had been polite but distant when she questioned details in their reports. And Thomas himself, in that last phone call, had spoken in a way that suggested he knew he might not be coming home. The interior of Air Force Two was unlike anything the group from Gate 22C had ever experienced. The aircraft's cabin had been converted into a flying command center, with secure communication equipment, briefing areas, and workstations that could handle classified information at the highest levels. A Air Force colonel in dress blues greeted them as they boarded. Mrs. Anderson, I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes. We spoke on the phone about the ceremony in Washington. Sophia recognized the voice immediately. Colonel Hayes, I take it the ceremony has been postponed? Yes, ma'am. Significantly postponed. What we thought was going to be a routine posthumous decoration has become something much more complex. Colonel Hayes gestured toward a secure briefing area. Ma'am, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I need you to understand that your son may have saved thousands of lives with his actions on his final day. As they settled into the briefing area, Dr. Thompson found himself thinking about the randomness of the evening's events. If he hadn't been sitting near Sophia at the gate, if Elena hadn't decided to intervene, If Janet Morrison had been even slightly more professional in her approach, would this truth have remained buried forever? Elena Vasquez activated her phone's recording function, then thought better of it and turned it off. Some stories were too important to be constrained by the fear of security violations. Whatever was about to be revealed would find its way into the public consciousness eventually. Truth had a way of surfacing, especially when it involved the sacrifice of good people. Colonel Hayes opened a secure briefing folder and spread several documents across the table. Satellite photographs, intelligence reports, communications intercepts, the bureaucratic evidence of events that had unfolded half a world away 3 years earlier. Mrs. Anderson, on October 15th, 3 years ago, your son's unit was conducting what they believed to be a routine patrol in the Kandahar province. What they didn't know was that they were actually part of a larger intelligence operation designed to track a suspected terrorist cell that had been planning an attack on American soil. Sophia stared at the satellite photographs, trying to reconcile the black and white images with the mental picture she had of her son's final day. What kind of attack? A coordinated bombing of 3 elementary schools in major American cities. Schools with significant populations of military children, the sons and daughters of service members deployed overseas. Colonel Hayes's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what had been at stake. The attack was scheduled for the week your son's unit was killed. The revelation hit Sophia like a physical blow. Dr. Thompson reached out instinctively to steady her, his medical training recognizing the signs of someone processing traumatic information. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes as she began to understand the magnitude of what Thomas Anderson had died preventing. How do you know? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Hayes pointed to one of the communications intercepts. Because your son discovered the operational details 3 days before the attack was scheduled to occur. He found documents in a compound his unit had been sent to investigate. Documents that revealed not just the target schools, but the specific timing and methodology. The school, Sophia breathed, remembering Thomas's cryptic phone call. He told me to remember the word school if anyone ever came asking questions. Yes, ma'am. Because he knew that if something happened to him, that single word would be the key to unlocking the intelligence he had discovered. Intelligence that was too sensitive to transmit through normal military channels. Janet Morrison, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the briefing, finally found her voice. But why was this classified? If he prevented a terrorist attack, shouldn't that be something to celebrate? Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with Agent Mitchell before responding. Because, ma'am, the terrorist cell your son exposed had been infiltrated by a double agent working for the CIA, an agent who had been feeding information to American intelligence for months. When Sergeant Anderson discovered the school bombing plot, he inadvertently exposed the double agent's position. The pieces began falling into place for Elena, her investigative instincts helping her see the larger picture. Someone had to choose between saving the schools and protecting the double agent. Exactly. And the decision was made to prioritize the long-term intelligence value of maintaining the agent's cover. Sergeant Anderson was ordered to withdraw from the compound without acting on the information he had discovered. Sophia felt the world tilt beneath her feet. They told him not to stop the attack. They told him to trust that there were other ways to prevent it, ways that wouldn't compromise ongoing intelligence operations. Colonel Hayes's voice carried the weight of institutional guilt. Your son disagreed with that assessment. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of Air Force Two's engines as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude. Outside the windows, the lights of major cities passed below like distant stars, each one representing thousands of families who had no idea how close they had come to unimaginable tragedy. What did Thomas do? Sophia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. He acted on his own initiative. Against direct orders, he transmitted the intelligence about the school bombing plot through unofficial channels, encrypted messages, hidden in routine family communications, coded references in letters home, information buried in places where it would eventually surface, even if he didn't survive to deliver it personally. Colonel Hayes pulled out a thick folder of documents. These are copies of every letter your son sent home during his final deployment. Our analysts have been working for 3 years to decode the intelligence he embedded in his personal communications. Sophia's hands trembled as she opened the folder and saw Thomas's familiar handwriting. But now, instead of simple family updates, she could see the hidden patterns, references to dates and locations, descriptions of people and places that seemed random but followed a careful code. In his letter about the children in the village who learned to say, "Thank you" in English, Colonel Hayes explained, he was actually providing the names and locations of the terrorist cell members. The candy he mentioned giving them. Those were code words for the types of explosives being prepared. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, studying the documents with the analytical mind of someone trained to look for patterns. This is incredible. He turned his personal correspondence into an intelligence dead drop. More than that, Agent Mitchell added. He created a system that would only make sense to someone who knew him personally, someone who could recognize the difference between his normal way of communicating and the coded messages he was embedding. Elena understood immediately. His mother. He knew that if something happened to him, his mother would be the one person who would read every letter carefully enough to notice the patterns. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the magnitude of what Thomas had done. He hadn't just died serving his country. He had sacrificed his life to save children he would never meet, in schools he would never see, using a code that only she could have unlocked. But why didn't anyone figure this out sooner? Dr. Thompson asked. Colonel Hayes' expression darkened. Because there were people in the intelligence community who didn't want it figured out. People who had made the decision to prioritize the double agent's cover over preventing the school attacks. When Sergeant Anderson was killed, they classified his entire file to prevent anyone from discovering that he had been right to disobey orders. Someone in our own government tried to bury this? Elena asked, her journalist instincts recognizing the shape of a cover-up. Not just tried, Agent Mitchell confirmed. They succeeded for 3 years. It was only when Mrs. Anderson's security clearance was reactivated for the ceremony that automated systems began cross-referencing her son's coded letters with current intelligence databases. The patterns finally triggered alerts that couldn't be ignored. Sophia looked up from the letters, her eyes blazing with an emotion that was part grief, part pride, and part fury. Someone tried to prevent me from coming to Washington tonight. Someone who knew that if I testified about what Thomas had told me, their cover-up would be exposed. Yes, ma'am. Which is why your airline reservation was sabotaged, why you were treated so poorly at the gate. Someone was hoping you would simply give up and go home. Janet Morrison spoke up from her corner of the briefing area, her voice small and ashamed. They used us. They used our prejudices and assumptions as a weapon against her. That's exactly what they did, Agent Mitchell confirmed. They counted on airline staff making assumptions about an elderly woman traveling alone, on bureaucratic indifference overriding common decency. They weaponized ordinary discrimination to serve their own agenda. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it encountered turbulence, a reminder that they were traveling through unstable air toward an uncertain destination. But for the first time in 3 years, Sophia Anderson felt like she was finally moving toward something that resembled truth. Colonel Hayes, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, you said Thomas saved thousands of lives. How? Because despite the official decision to protect the double agent, some people in the intelligence community recognized that your son was right. They used his coded information to quietly prevent the school attacks without revealing how they had obtained the intelligence. 3 elementary schools received anonymous bomb threats on the morning the attacks were scheduled, forcing evacuations that saved every single child. Anonymous bomb threats, Dr. Thompson repeated. Someone in the government called in fake threats to prevent real bombs from killing children. It was the only way to act on Sergeant Anderson's intelligence without exposing the source. Messy, unofficial, and completely outside normal protocols. But it worked. Sophia closed her eyes and thought about Thomas, about the boy who had grown up believing that doing the right thing was more important than following orders. He had died believing that his sacrifice might save innocent children, never knowing that it actually had. Mrs. Anderson, Colonel Hayes said gently, "There's something else. The ceremony we were planning to honor your son? It's not just a posthumous decoration anymore. Based on what we've learned from his coded letters, the President is prepared to award him the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, reserved for acts of valor that went far beyond the call of duty." Sophia thought about the small boy who had once brought her injured birds to heal, who had grown up to be a man willing to die to protect other people's children. "But that's not why we're here tonight," Agent Mitchell added. "We're here because your son's coded letters contained more than just information about the school bombing plot. They contained intelligence about ongoing operations, about people who are still in positions of power, about corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government." Elena Vasquez felt the familiar thrill of recognition that came when she stumbled onto a story that would change everything. "You need Mrs. Anderson to decode the rest of the letters. We need Mrs. Anderson to help us understand what her son was really trying to tell us," Colonel Hayes confirmed. "Because we think the people who tried to prevent her from coming to Washington tonight are the same people who have been covering up his intelligence for 3 years. Outside the aircraft's windows, the lights of Washington, D.C. were beginning to appear on the horizon, the familiar landmarks of power and politics glowing against the darkness. But tonight, those landmarks would be illuminated by a different kind of light, the truth that had been carried for 3 years in the letters of a dead soldier, decoded at last by the love of a mother who had never stopped believing that her son had died for something important. Sophia Anderson held the letters close to her chest and prepared to honor her son's sacrifice in the only way that mattered, by ensuring that the truth he had died protecting would finally be heard by the people who needed to hear it most. The secure briefing room in the Pentagon's C-ring felt like the center of a storm that had been building for 3 years. Sophia Anderson sat at a polished conference table surrounded by some of the most powerful people in American intelligence. But the real power in the room belonged to the stack of her son's letters that lay before her like archaeological evidence of hidden history. General Marcus Webb, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, entered the room with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years learning how to carry impossible burdens. Behind him came Deputy Director of National Intelligence Sarah Chen, whose reputation for uncovering institutional corruption had made her both respected and feared throughout Washington's intelligence community. "Mrs. Anderson," General Webb said, his voice carrying the gravity of someone about to reveal state secrets. "What you're about to hear represents one of the most significant intelligence failures in modern American history. Not because we failed to prevent an attack, but because we nearly chose to allow one." The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of electronic surveillance countermeasures that protected classified conversations from electronic eavesdropping. Dr. Thompson, Elena Vasquez, and Janet Morrison sat along the wall, their presence a reminder that truth had emerged not through official channels, but through the kindness of strangers who had chosen to stand up for what was right. "Mrs. Anderson," Deputy Director Chen began, "your son's coded letters have led us to evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the intelligence community. People who were willing to allow terrorist attacks on American children in order to protect intelligence assets that served their own political agendas." Sophia looked down at Thomas's letters, seeing now how each carefully crafted sentence had been both a message to her and a breadcrumb trail leading to the truth. "How many people were involved?" "We're still investigating, but initial evidence suggests at least 7 senior officials across multiple agencies. People who had the authority to classify information, to redirect investigations, to ensure that inconvenient truths remained buried. General Webb pulled up a secure display screen that showed organizational charts, communication flows, and financial records. Your son didn't just discover a terrorist plot, Mrs. Anderson. He stumbled onto evidence that some members of our own intelligence community were more interested in protecting their career advancement than protecting American children. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Elena Vasquez felt her hands tremble as she realized the magnitude of the story she was witnessing. This wasn't just about a brave soldier who had saved lives. It was about institutional corruption at the highest levels of government. The double agent your son's discovery threatened to expose. Deputy Director Chen continued, wasn't just providing intelligence about terrorist activities. He was providing information that helped certain American officials advance their careers, secure promotions, and justify budget increases for their departments. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his analytical mind processing the implications. They were using a terrorist infiltrator to manufacture intelligence successes. Exactly. The agent would provide information about minor plots and activities that made his handlers look effective and prescient. In return, they would protect his cover and allow him to continue operating, even when that operation put American lives at risk. Sophia felt a cold rage building in her chest as she began to understand the full scope of what Thomas had died fighting against. My son was ordered to stand down, not to protect an intelligence asset, but to protect the careers of people who were using that asset for personal gain. Yes, ma'am. And when he refused to comply, when he chose to prioritize American children over the convenience of his superiors, they made sure that his death would bury the evidence of their corruption. Colonel Hayes, who had been coordinating with investigators throughout the night, entered the room with a new folder of documents. Ma'am, we've just received confirmation that the people who sabotaged your airline reservation tonight are the same people who have been blocking investigations into your son's death for 3 years. The connection was more direct than anyone had imagined. Janet Morrison, who had been sitting in stunned silence as she processed her role in the conspiracy, finally found her voice. They knew Mrs. Anderson was coming to Washington. They knew that if she testified about what her son had told her, their cover-up would be exposed. More than that, Agent Mitchell added, entering the room with updates from ongoing investigations. They had people monitoring her communications, tracking her travel plans, waiting for any sign that she might be prepared to share what she knew. Elena Vasquez felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's why the harassment at the airport was so systematic. It wasn't random prejudice, it was a coordinated effort to prevent her from reaching Washington. The gate agents were unknowing participants, Deputy Director Chen confirmed. But the system override that downgraded Mrs. Anderson's seat was initiated by someone with high-level access to airline reservation systems. Someone who knew exactly how to exploit institutional biases to achieve their goals. Dr. Thompson thought about his grandmother's advice about standing up for people who were being mistreated, and realized that sometimes the smallest acts of decency could have the largest consequences. If he and Elena hadn't intervened at the gate, if they hadn't insisted on fair treatment for Sophia, the conspiracy might have succeeded. Mrs. Anderson, General Webb said, "We need your help to finish what your son started. The coded information in his letters has given us enough evidence to begin prosecutions, but we need you to help us understand the full scope of what he discovered." Sophia picked up one of Thomas's letters, the one about teaching local children to play baseball, which they now knew contained the organizational structure of the terrorist cell and their American contacts. "What do you need me to do?" "We need you to walk us through every conversation you had with Thomas during his final deployment, every unusual comment or request, every piece of information that seemed out of place at the time." Over the next 3 hours, Sophia deconstructed 3 years of grief and memory, revealing the careful way Thomas had prepared her to carry forward his mission without either of them fully understanding what that mission would require. Each phone call, each letter, each seemingly casual conversation had been part of an elaborate plan to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. In his second-to-last letter, Sophia explained, Thomas wrote about a stray dog that had started following their unit around. He described how the dog seemed friendly but couldn't be trusted, how it would disappear for days and then return with information about where to find food. Deputy Director Chen consulted her notes. Our analysts believe that was his way of describing the double agent, someone who appeared helpful but whose loyalties were fundamentally unclear. But there was something else, Sophia continued. He wrote that the dog had bitten one of the soldiers and that they were worried about infection. He said they were considering putting the dog down for everyone's safety. The bite victim, General Webb said, consulting intelligence files. Do you remember what Thomas said about him? He said the soldier was someone everyone trusted, someone who had been with the unit for a long time. But after the bite, he started acting strangely, making decisions that put other soldiers at risk. Sophia paused, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. Thomas wasn't just talking about a dog bite, was he? No, ma'am. We believe he was telling you that someone in his own unit had been compromised. Someone who was feeding information to the terrorist cell, using the double agent as a communication channel. The betrayal was even deeper than they had imagined. Thomas had discovered not just a terrorist plot, but evidence that someone within his own military unit was actively collaborating with the enemy. Someone who had access to American operational plans, who could provide real-time intelligence about troop movements and mission parameters. Elena Vasquez felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the isolation Thomas must have felt in his final days, unable to trust his chain of command, unable to trust his fellow soldiers, carrying intelligence that could save lives but having no safe way to deliver it. Who was it? Dr. Thompson asked. Who was the compromised soldier? Colonel Hayes consulted a classified file. Staff Sergeant David Morrison. He was killed in the same IED explosion that killed Sergeant Anderson. Janet Morrison gasped from her seat along the wall. Morrison. That's my ex-husband's name. David Morrison. The room fell silent as everyone processed this latest revelation. Agent Mitchell moved to her computer terminal and began rapidly typing, cross-referencing personnel records and family connections. Mrs. Morrison, she said after several minutes of intense research, your ex-husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan, including the deployment where he was killed alongside Sergeant Anderson. Janet's face had gone pale. David and I were divorced 2 years before he deployed. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year when he died, but, oh God, he had access to airline reservation systems. He had worked for the airline before he enlisted. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. David Morrison had been feeding information to terrorists, had been exposed by Thomas Anderson, and had been killed in the same explosion that silenced the man who discovered his betrayal. But before his death, he had shared his airline access codes with his ex-wife, not telling her they would eventually be used to prevent his crimes from being exposed. Mrs. Morrison, Deputy Director Chen said gently, we don't believe you were aware of your ex-husband's activities or the significance of the access codes he gave you. But someone has been using your credentials to monitor and manipulate airline reservations for 3 years. Janet Morrison broke down completely, understanding finally that she had been an unwitting participant in a conspiracy that had started with her ex-husband's betrayal and had continued long after his death. Her treatment of Sophia Anderson hadn't been random prejudice. It had been orchestrated by people who knew exactly how to exploit her access and her biases. Mrs. Anderson, General Webb said, your son died trying to expose not just a terrorist plot, but a network of corruption that included American military personnel, intelligence officials, and civilian contractors. The people who have been trying to silence you tonight are the same people who have been profiting from that corruption for years. Sophia looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked their careers to bring this truth to light. Dr. Thompson, who had stood up for a stranger at an airport gate. Elena Vasquez, who had used her investigative skills to document injustice. Even Janet Morrison, whose unwitting participation in the conspiracy had become the key to unraveling it. What happens now? Sophia asked. Now, Deputy Director Chen said, we finish what your son started. The evidence in his letters, combined with what we've discovered tonight, is enough to initiate prosecutions at the highest levels of government. People are going to prison. Mrs. Anderson, important people who thought they were untouchable. Colonel Hayes approached with a new document. Ma'am, the President has asked me to deliver this personally. Sophia opened the official envelope and found herself looking at the citation for Thomas's Medal of Honor, but also something else, a letter from the President himself, handwritten on official stationery. Dear Mrs. Anderson, she read aloud, her voice carrying across the secure briefing room. Your son died protecting children he would never meet, fighting corruption he was never supposed to discover, upholding values that some of his superiors had forgotten. But more than that, he raised a mother who had the courage to honor his sacrifice by insisting on the truth, even when powerful people tried to silence her. America owes both of you a debt that can never be repaid. The room was silent except for the sound of Elena Vasquez quietly weeping and Dr. Thompson clearing his throat to hide his own emotion. Janet Morrison sat with her face in her hands, processing the magnitude of how her ex-husband's betrayal had echoed through the years to nearly prevent justice from being served. There's something else, Agent Mitchell said, consulting her secure tablet. The investigation into tonight's events has already led to arrests. 7 people have been taken into custody, including 3 senior intelligence officials and 2 Pentagon contractors. The conspiracy your son died exposing is finally being dismantled. Over the following hours, as dawn began to break over Washington, D.C., the scope of Thomas Anderson's sacrifice became clear. His coded letters had provided evidence not just of the school bombing plot, but of a systematic effort by American officials to manipulate intelligence for personal gain. The terrorist double agent had been feeding information to his handlers for years, allowing them to claim credit for preventing attacks that were never serious threats, while ignoring real dangers that threatened their profitable arrangement. School bombing plot was different, General Webb explained as the briefing continued. It was real, it was imminent, and it threatened to expose how useless their pet double agent actually was. They couldn't prevent it through their usual channels without revealing that their intelligence source was compromised. So they ordered Thomas to stand down, Dr. Thompson said, hoping the attacks would happen and be blamed on intelligence failures rather than institutional corruption. Exactly. Your son's refusal to comply, his decision to encode the intelligence in his personal letters, represented a fundamental challenge to their entire operation. Sophia thought about the phone call Thomas had made 2 days before he died. How his voice had carried a weight she hadn't understood at the time. He had known he was going to disobey orders, had known the likely consequences, but had also known that some things were more important than following commands from corrupted superiors. Elena Vasquez, who had been documenting everything with the permission of the intelligence officials, looked up from her notes. Mrs. Anderson, do you realize what you've accomplished tonight? You've helped expose one of the largest intelligence scandals in American history. Your son's letters are going to save more lives than anyone imagined. But at what cost? Sophia asked, thinking about all the families who would never know how close their children had come to being casualties of institutional ambition. The cost of truth is always high, Deputy Director Chen said. But the cost of lies is higher. What your son did, what you've done tonight by refusing to be silenced, has reminded everyone in this room why we took oaths to protect and defend the Constitution rather than protect and defend our own careers. The morning sun climbed higher over the Potomac River. The secure briefing room began to empty as various officials departed to coordinate the massive investigation that Thomas Anderson's letters had finally triggered. Arrests would be made, congressional hearings would be scheduled, and the entire intelligence community would undergo reforms designed to prevent future corruption. But for Sophia Anderson, the most important moment came when Colonel Hayes approached her with a simple wooden box. "Mrs. Anderson, this contains your son's Medal of Honor, but also something else we found in his personal effects that was never returned to you." Inside the box, along with the gleaming medal that represented the nation's highest recognition of valor, was a small photograph, a picture of a young boy bringing his mother an injured bird he had found in their backyard. Both of them focused intently on the task of healing something that had been broken. "He carried this with him on every deployment," Colonel Hayes said softly. "According to his fellow soldiers, he said it reminded him why the work mattered, because someone had to care for the things that couldn't protect themselves." Sophia held the photograph against her chest and felt 3 years of grief transform into something else, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Thomas hadn't just died serving his country. He had died serving the values that made the country worth serving. And now, finally, his sacrifice would be honored not just with medals and ceremonies, but with the justice he had died trying to achieve. Dr. Thompson approached as the briefing room continued to empty. "Mrs. Anderson, I want you to know that what happened at the airport tonight wasn't just about airline prejudice. It was about people recognizing something in you that demanded respect, even when they didn't understand why." Elena Vasquez joined them, her reporter's notebook filled with details that would eventually become part of the historical record. "Mrs. Anderson, when this story becomes public, you're going to be seen as a hero. But I think you should know that you were already a hero long before anyone realized it. You raised a son who valued truth over safety, and you honored his memory by insisting on truth even when powerful people tried to silence you." Janet Morrison approached last, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had watched her entire worldview collapse and rebuild in a single night. "Mrs. Anderson, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything that happened at the gate tonight. I was part of something terrible without knowing it, and you forgave me even when you had every reason not to." Sophia looked at the small group that had accompanied her from Gate 22C to the Pentagon's most secure briefing rooms. Strangers who had become allies, witnesses who had become participants in something much larger than any of them had imagined. "People keep calling me a hero," she said quietly, "but heroes are the people who stand up for what's right when they don't have to, when it would be easier to look away. You all did that tonight. You all chose to see a person being treated unfairly and decided to do something about it." As they prepared to leave the Pentagon, Agent Mitchell provided them with secure transportation back to their various destinations. The investigation would continue for months, the trials would take years, and the reforms would reshape American intelligence operations for generations. But the moment that had started it all, an elderly woman being denied her rightful seat on an airplane, would be remembered as the small injustice that exposed a massive conspiracy. "Mrs. Anderson," Agent Mitchell said as they walked toward the exit, "there's one more thing. The President would like to meet with you later today to personally present your son's Medal of Honor, but he also wants to discuss something else, a position with the Intelligence Oversight Committee. If you're interested in helping to make sure something like this never happens again." Sophia considered the offer as they emerged into the bright Washington morning. 3 years earlier, she had been a grieving mother who spent her days reading her son's letters and tending his garden. Now she was being offered the chance to honor his memory by helping to reform the very systems that had failed him. "Agent Mitchell," she said, "I think Thomas would want me to accept that position, but only if Dr. Thompson and Elena Vasquez can serve as civilian advisors. Heroes shouldn't work alone." As they drove through the capital city where Laws were made and justice was supposed to be served. Sophia Anderson held her son's letters in one hand and his Medal of Honor in the other. The weight of both reminded her that truth was like those injured birds Thomas used to bring her. Fragile, in need of careful tending, but capable of soaring once it was healed. The conspiracy that had tried to silence her had failed, not because she was powerful, but because she had refused to surrender the memory of someone who had been powerful in all the ways that truly mattered. And now, finally, Thomas Anderson's voice would be heard by the people who most needed to listen. 6 months later, the Intelligence Oversight Committee hearing room buzzed with the controlled energy of democracy functioning as it was designed to. Sophia Anderson sat at the witness table, no longer the dismissed elderly woman from Gate 22C, but now officially titled as Senior Civilian Advisor for Institutional Accountability. The transformation was remarkable not because she had changed, but because the world had finally recognized what had always been there. Senator Elizabeth Warren leaned into her microphone. "Mrs. Anderson, it's been 6 months since your son's letters exposed the largest intelligence scandal in modern American history. Can you tell the committee how many convictions have resulted from the evidence he provided?" 17 convictions so far, Senator, with 12 more cases pending trial. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Sophia's voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to speak truth to power. The real change has been in the institutional reforms that prevent this kind of corruption from taking root again. In the gallery behind her, Dr. Marcus Thompson adjusted his new identification badge. His appointment as medical advisor to the Veterans Affairs Oversight Board had come directly from his actions that night at Gate 22C, had discovered that standing up for principle in small moments prepared you for larger responsibilities when they arose. Elena Vasquez, now serving as the committee's investigative journalist liaison, raised her hand. "Mrs. Anderson, can you speak to the impact these reforms have had on military families?" "Elena, you've seen the letters we receive every week from families who now know that their loved ones' sacrifices are protected by people who can't profit from covering up their heroism. But more importantly, we've created systems where service members can report corruption without fear of retaliation." The Thomas Anderson Whistleblower Protection Act had passed Congress unanimously 3 months earlier, establishing unprecedented safeguards for military personnel who discovered evidence of institutional misconduct. The law was named not just for a fallen soldier, but for the principle that truth-telling should be protected, even when it was inconvenient for those in power. 2 years later, Thomas Anderson Memorial Garden at Portland Veterans Hospital bloomed with late spring flowers, their colors brilliant against the backdrop of the Pacific Northwest's eternal green. Sophia knelt beside the memorial stone, not in grief this time, but in the quiet satisfaction of work completed and promises kept. "Mom?" The voice belonged to Jessica Chen, a young intelligence analyst who had been inspired by Thomas's story to join the military. She approached with the respectful caution of someone meeting a living legend. "You can call me Sophia, dear. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you. The reforms you helped implement. They saved my career last month when I discovered evidence of contractor fraud. 3 years ago, I would have been ordered to stay quiet or face retaliation. Instead, I was protected and the fraud was stopped." Jessica wasn't unique. Across the military and intelligence communities, Thomas Anderson's name had become synonymous with the principle that protecting American interests sometimes meant challenging American institutions. His mother's work on the Oversight Committee had created pathways for ethical service, members to report corruption without destroying their careers. "Jessica," Sophia said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands, "my son believed that the uniform meant something more important than following orders. It meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. You honored that belief." As they walked through the garden together, Sophia reflected on how much had changed since that night at Gate 22C. The Memorial Garden was just one of dozens that had been established across the country. each one funded by money recovered from the corruption Thomas had exposed. His letters hadn't just saved lives, they had generated enough recovered funds to support veterans programs for decades. 5 years later, the Anderson Institute for Ethical Intelligence occupied a beautiful campus overlooking the Potomac River. Its mission simple but revolutionary: training intelligence professionals to prioritize national security over personal advancement. Sophia, now 78 but still sharp as a blade, delivered the graduation address to the Institute's 5th class of graduates. "My son wrote me 47 letters during his final deployment," she told the audience of new intelligence officers. "I've memorized every word, not because they contain state secrets, but because they contain something more valuable: the voice of someone who refused to compromise his principles, even when it cost him everything." In the audience, Dr. Thompson sat with his own son, Marcus Jr., who was graduating from the Institute's Medical Intelligence Program. The elder Dr. Thompson had discovered that his intervention at Gate 22C had been the beginning of a second career dedicated to ensuring that military medical systems served veterans rather than bureaucratic convenience. Elena Vasquez, now Director of Public Accountability for the Institute, watched from the faculty section. Her book about the Thomas Anderson case had become required reading at intelligence training programs worldwide, not as a cautionary tale, but as inspiration for those who chose service over self-interest. "The question you'll face in your careers," Sophia continued, "isn't whether you'll encounter corruption or institutional pressure to compromise your values. You will. The question is whether you'll have the courage to respond the way my son did, not with anger or rebellion, but with quiet determination to protect the people and principles that make our work meaningful." Even Janet Morrison was present, though few people recognized her. She had rebuilt her life after the scandal, becoming an advocate for transportation workers' rights and speaking frequently about how ordinary people could become unwitting participants in larger conspiracies. Her experience at Gate 22C had taught her that small acts of cruelty could serve larger evils, just as small acts of kindness could serve larger goods. 10 years later, the White House Rose Garden ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the Thomas Anderson intelligence reforms drew representatives from across the government and military. President Sarah Chen, the former deputy director of national intelligence who had helped expose the original conspiracy, spoke about how one soldier's letters had reshaped American intelligence operations. Sergeant Thomas Anderson died believing that truth was worth more than convenience, that protecting innocent lives mattered more than protecting institutional careers. His mother, Sophia Anderson, honored that belief by refusing to let his sacrifice be forgotten or minimized. Sophia, now 83 and using a wheelchair but still formidable in presence, sat in the front row surrounded by the extended family her work had created. Dr. Thompson's son had become a military physician. Elena Vasquez's daughter was studying intelligence analysis. Janet Morrison's nephew was serving as an Army lieutenant, inspired by stories of how ordinary people could serve extraordinary purposes. Ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new addition to the White House, a small plaque near the entrance that read, "In memory of those who chose truth over convenience, justice over advancement, and service over self. May their example guide all who enter here." As the ceremony ended and guests began to disperse across the Rose Garden, Sophia Anderson remained in her wheelchair for a moment longer, watching the late afternoon sunlight play across the memorial plaque. At 83, she had lived to see her son's sacrifice not just honored, but transformed into lasting institutional change that would protect future generations of service members who chose truth over convenience. Dr. Thompson approached with his son, now a military physician inspired by the Anderson legacy. Elena Vasquez joined them with her daughter, a recent graduate of the Intelligence Oversight Program. Even Janet Morrison was present, her own journey from unwitting participant to advocate for transparency serving as a reminder that redemption was possible for those willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work for justice. "Mrs. Anderson," Dr. Thompson said quietly, "I think Thomas would be proud not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've accomplished it, with grace, determination, and an absolute refusal to let bitterness corrupt the pursuit of truth." Sophia smiled, thinking of the young boy who had once brought her injured birds to heal, who had grown into a man willing to sacrifice everything to protect children he would never meet. The leather satchel in her lap contained his letters, but more importantly, it contained the proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. "The Profe, truth has a way of persisting," she said, echoing words her son had written in his final letter home. "It just needs people willing to carry it forward, one act of courage at a time." As the White House ceremony concluded and the Anderson family, bound not by blood but by shared commitment to the values Thomas had died protecting, prepared to return to their various homes and responsibilities, they carried with them the understanding that heroism wasn't about being powerful enough to fight injustice. It was about being brave enough to recognize injustice and refusing to participate in it, even when resistance seemed futile. The story that had begun with an elderly woman being denied her rightful seat on an airplane had become a testament to the power of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage. And in the end, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that every moment held the potential for heroism, and every person deserved someone willing to stand with them when the powerful tried to make them invisible. The truth, carefully tended and fiercely protected, would continue to soar. This creates a definitive, satisfying ending at the 10-year mark and removes all the excessive flash-forwards that diluted the story's impact. 15 years later, the small house in Portland, Oregon looked much the same as it had when Thomas Anderson was growing up, except for the steady stream of visitors who came to meet his mother and learn about the man whose letters had changed American intelligence forever. Sophia, now 88, still tended the garden Thomas had planted, though she moved more slowly among the roses that bloomed each year in defiant beauty. Dr. Thompson, retired but still volunteering at veterans' hospitals, visited every few months. Elena Vasquez, now a professor of investigative journalism, brought her students annually to interview Sophia about the intersection of personal courage and institutional change. Even Janet Morrison, now in her 70s, remained part of the extended family that had formed around Thomas's legacy. "Mrs. Anderson," asked Sarah Kim, a young journalism student, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dr. Thompson and Miss Vasquez hadn't stood up for you that night at the airport?" Sophia considered the question while deadheading roses in the morning sun. "I think the truth would have found a way to surface eventually. Truth has a way of persisting, especially when it's carried by people who refuse to let it be buried. But I'm grateful that I didn't have to carry it alone." The leather satchel that had started it all sat on the garden table, still containing Thomas's letters, though they had long since been declassified and published. More importantly, it now contained new letters, thank you notes from intelligence officers who had been protected by the Anderson reforms, from military families whose loved ones' sacrifices had been honored rather than covered up, from children who would never know how close they had come to being victims of institutional indifference. 20 years later, Thomas Anderson Memorial Library at the CIA headquarters in Langley contained not just his letters and the historical documentation of the conspiracy he had exposed, but something more valuable, an ongoing collection of ethical case studies contributed by intelligence professionals who faced their own moral crossroads and chose to follow Anderson's example. Sophia Anderson had died peacefully in her sleep 2 years earlier, at age 91, still surrounded by the family of friends and colleagues who had been drawn together by her son's sacrifice and her own determination to honor it. Her funeral had been attended by 4 former presidents, dozens of intelligence officials, and thousands of ordinary people who understood that extraordinary courage often came in quiet packages. Dr. Thompson, now 90 and one of the last surviving witnesses to that night at Gate 22C, spoke at the dedication of the Memorial Library. Sophia Anderson taught us that heroism isn't about being powerful enough to fight injustice. It's about being brave enough to recognize injustice and refusing to participate in it, even when resistance seems futile. Elena Vasquez, now a grandmother herself, had written the definitive biography of both Thomas and Sophia Anderson. The book's final chapter asked a simple question: how many potential heroes pass through our lives disguised as ordinary people being treated unfairly? How many chances do we miss to change history simply by choosing kindness over convenience? The Anderson Institute continued to graduate new classes of intelligence, professionals trained to prioritize ethical service over institutional advancement. The Thomas Anderson Whistleblower Protection Act had been strengthened multiple times, creating robust safeguards for anyone who chose to expose corruption rather than participate in it. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was simpler: the understanding that truth-telling was not a single heroic act, but a daily choice made by ordinary people who refused to let extraordinary circumstances compromise their basic humanity. 20-5 years later, Gate 22C at the airport where it all began had been renamed the Thomas Anderson Memorial Gate, with a small plaque that told the story of how institutional prejudice had merely prevented one of the most important intelligence breakthroughs in American history. The plaque concluded with a simple reminder: every person deserves dignity. Every story deserves to be heard. Every truth deserves protection. The young gate agents who worked there now learned the story as part of their training, understanding that their job was not just to process passengers, but to recognize that they never knew when they might be serving someone whose story could change the world. Dr. Thompson's grandson, now working as a military physician, made a pilgrimage to the Memorial Gate every year on the anniversary of that October night. Elena Vasquez's daughter, now a senior intelligence analyst, did the same. Janet Morrison's great-niece, serving as an Air Force lieutenant, understood that she owed her opportunity to serve honorably to an elderly woman who had refused to be silenced and the strangers who had chosen to stand with her. The conspiracy that had tried to bury Thomas Anderson's letters had been dismantled, its perpetrators imprisoned or disgraced, their institutional damage repaired by decades of careful reform. But the positive conspiracy that had formed around protecting and honoring his truth continued to grow, touching new lives every year, inspiring new acts of quiet courage in the face of institutional indifference. 30 years later, the small park across from the Pentagon now featured a bronze statue of a young soldier in combat gear, kneeling to help an injured child, the image captured from one of Thomas Anderson's actual photographs from his deployment. But more visitors came to see the bench beside the statue, where an elderly woman in a simple coat sat holding a leather satchel, her face turned toward the Pentagon where truth had finally been heard by people with the power to act on it. The inscription on the bench read, "Sophia Anderson, 1942 to 2067, Mother, Truth Teller, reminder that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable." Children who visited the memorial with their school classes learned a simple lesson: that heroes weren't always the people with the most power, but the people who chose to use whatever power they had to protect those who had less. They learned that standing up for someone being treated unfairly might seem like a small thing, but small things could grow into movements that changed the world. Veterans who visited the memorial understood something different, but equally important: that their service would be honored not just with parades and ceremonies, but with institutional commitment to the values that made their sacrifice meaningful. The reforms that had grown from Thomas Anderson's letters ensured that future whistleblowers would be protected rather than silenced, that institutional corruption would be exposed rather than rewarded. Intelligence professionals who came to pay their respects at the memorial carried With them the understanding that their oaths were not to their supervisors or their agencies, but to the Constitution and the people it was designed to protect. The Anderson Institute continued to graduate new classes of analysts and officers, trained to see institutional pressure as a test of character rather than an excuse for compromise. 35 years later, final flash forward, the elderly man shuffling slowly through the Thomas Anderson Memorial Park leaned heavily on his walking stick, but his eyes remained sharp with the intelligence that had made him one of the most respected physicians of his generation. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Jr., son of the man who had stood up for Sophia Anderson at Gate 22C, made this pilgrimage every year on the anniversary of the night that had changed everything. His own grandson walked beside him, a young intelligence analyst fresh from the Anderson Institute, carrying forward the family tradition of service guided by principle rather than convenience. They paused before the bronze statue, reading the inscription that had inspired generations of public servants. Truth persists not because it is convenient, but because ordinary people choose to carry it forward, one act of courage at a time. "Grandfather," the young man asked, "do you think they knew?" That night at the airport, do you think any of them understood how important that moment would become? Dr. Thompson, Jr. considered the question while studying the face of the bronze statue, seeing in its features not just the artistic representation of a fallen soldier, but the echo of his father's stories about a night when strangers had chosen to see injustice and refused to participate in it. "I think they understood something more important," he said finally. They understood that every moment is potentially that important, that every person being treated unfairly deserves someone to stand with them, that every small act of courage makes larger acts of courage possible. As the sun set over the Memorial Park, casting long shadows from the bronze figures, the inscription on Sophia Anderson's bench caught the last light of day. "Remember that truth-telling is not a single heroic act, but a daily choice made by ordinary people who refuse to let extraordinary circumstances compromise their basic humanity." The legacy lived on not in monuments or ceremonies, but in the understanding that heroism was available to anyone willing to recognize injustice and choose kindness over convenience, truth over comfort, service over self-interest. Thomas Anderson's letters had saved lives, but his mother's determination to honor his sacrifice had saved something more precious: the idea that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. And somewhere in the distance, though no one at the memorial could hear it, the sound of jet engines continued to carry people toward their destinations, each passenger a potential hero in disguise, each flight crew member a guardian of dignity, each journey an opportunity to choose what kind of world we create together. The truth, carefully tended and fiercely protected, continued to soar. Creating detailed stories like this requires significant time and research. If you're finding value in this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss our latest stories.